The town of Riverbend was covered in a thin veil of mist as the sun peeked over the distant hills. The air was eerily calm, with only the chirping of birds and the slow crunch of wagon wheels on gravel breaking the silence. Under the soft morning light, an old yet sturdy figure walked forward, each step deliberate and steady. Thomas Grayson, 92 years old, a World War II veteran, still kept his morning walk routine as if it were a sacred ritual. He stopped in front of a small cafe on the corner, where familiar townsfolk usually gathered over hot coffee. But today, something was off. No warm smiles, no casual greetings, just quick glances before people turned away. A heavy silence loomed over the place, like the tension before a storm. Thomas frowned. A strange unease crept into his chest, an old instinct stirring. His steps slowed as he approached his house, and that's when he saw it. A black, rusted truck was parked right in front of his yard. The engine was off, yet an ominous presence radiated from it like toxic fumes. 3 men stood stiffly at his doorstep, their dark eyes scanning the town like predators searching for prey. Thomas's grip tightened around his wooden cane. The cold morning breeze swept through the street, sending a sharp chill down his spine. He knew Riverbend's peace had just been shattered, and his blood-stained past was knocking at his door once more. Thomas stood motionless on the cracked sidewalk, his sharp eyes fixed on the men at his doorstep. Though his body had aged, his instincts had not dulled. He could recognize danger when he saw it. The tallest of the 3, a man with a scar running down his cheek, turned slightly, meeting Thomas's gaze with an unsettling smirk. A silent acknowledgement. A message. The world around him seemed to shrink. The once familiar streets of Riverbend, where he had spent decades living in peace, now felt foreign, tainted by the presence of these strangers. The past, which he had buried beneath years of quiet routines and small-town conversations, had clawed its way back, standing just a few feet from his door. With steady steps, Thomas approached. His wooden cane tapped against the ground, the only sound in the eerie silence. The men didn't move, but he could feel their tension, like wolves assessing an old lion. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice even but firm. The scarred man let out a chuckle, low and humorless. "Mr. Grayson," he drawled, the way a snake might whisper before striking. "Long time no see." Thomas's grip on his cane tightened. He knew that voice. He had heard it before, years ago, in a different life, in a place where survival meant making impossible choices. A gust of wind swept through the street, rustling the dry leaves at his feet. His mind raced, but his expression remained unreadable. He glanced at the truck, old but powerful, like something out of a bad memory. The license plate was caked in dirt, deliberately obscured. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice colder now. The scarred man stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Just paying our respects," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You were a legend, you know. Some debts never get forgotten." A flicker of something dangerous flashed in Thomas's eyes. He had worked hard to escape that life, to be just an old man living out his last years in peace. But these men weren't here to reminisce. They were here for something more. A tense silence followed. Across the street, a curtain shifted, a neighbor peeking out before quickly retreating. Fear had settled over Riverbend. Thomas exhaled slowly. He had 2 choices: turn away and pretend this was just a coincidence, or face the ghosts he thought he had outrun. And deep down he knew he had never really been free. Thomas watched as the men lingered outside his house, their presence tainting the peaceful morning. The scarred man's words clung to the air like the scent of distant rain, unshakable, heavy with promise. Some debts never get forgotten. His heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He had spent years perfecting that mask, hiding fear behind indifference, burying ghosts beneath routine. But ghosts had a way of digging themselves out, clawing back into the present. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, the sharp glint of a blade long kept in its sheath. The scarred man grinned, but his eyes were cold. "No problem at all, old man," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Just reminiscing. You left quite a mark back in the day." Thomas felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. He had worked hard to become someone else, someone better. But these men weren't here for nostalgia, they were here because they wanted something. He glanced at their truck again, noting the dirt-caked license plate, the reinforced bumper. These men were prepared for trouble. The question was, had they brought trouble to his doorstep, or were they testing to see if he still had some fight left in him? A rustling from inside the house made him tense. His wife had always been good at reading situations, and she was watching now, waiting for his signal. "You should go," Thomas said, his voice low. "There's nothing for you here." The scarred man chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get to decide that," he said. "Not after everything." The unspoken words hung between them, thick with history. "Not after what you did." Thomas's fingers curled around his cane, but not for support. His old injuries had stolen some of his strength, but not his instincts. He had spent a lifetime ensuring that, even when his body failed him, his mind and hands never would. The other two men shifted slightly, subtle, but telling. They were waiting for something. A signal? A moment of weakness? A creak from the porch behind him. Claire had stepped closer. Though she didn't say a word, Thomas could feel her presence, steady and unwavering. He had always admired that about her, her ability to stand beside him, no matter what shadows loomed. For a moment, everything was still. Then the scarred man sighed and took a step back, his smirk never faltering. "We'll be seeing you, Grayson." Thomas didn't respond. He watched as they climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life before the vehicle rumbled down the street. He stood there long after they were gone, staring at the empty road. "They're not finished," Claire said softly. Thomas exhaled. "No," he murmured. "They're not." The past had found him again. And this time, it wasn't leaving quietly. The night was thick with silence, the kind that weighed heavy on the chest, pressing against the ribs like an unspoken warning. Thomas sat at the edge of the bed, his fingers idly tracing the ridges of an old scar on his forearm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. Claire was watching him from the doorway, her presence steady but unreadable. "You're not telling me everything," she said finally. Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his gaze drift to the shadows pooling at the corners of the room. He had spent years mastering the art of silence, knowing that some truths were too sharp to be spoken aloud. But Claire had always been able to see through him, peeling away the layers he had built to keep her safe. "They're not here for money," he admitted. "Not just that." She took a step closer. "Then what?" Thomas clenched his jaw. "They want payback." The words hung between them, cold and undeniable. Claire inhaled sharply but didn't look away. "For what happened before," she said, more a statement than a question. He nodded. "I thought it was over." A humorless chuckle escaped him. "Guess I was wrong." A sudden noise outside made them both tense. The faint crunch of gravel beneath deliberate footsteps. Thomas moved instinctively, his body shifting with the ghost of old reflexes. He grabbed the gun from the nightstand, the metal cool against his palm. Claire had already reached for her own weapon. She wasn't the type to be left defenseless, not after everything they'd been through. The porch creaked. Then a knock, slow, deliberate. Thomas exhaled, steadying himself. He moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. 3 figures stood beyond the porch light, their outlines familiar. The scarred man was in the center, his hands in his pockets, his head tilted slightly as if he were enjoying himself. "We know you're in there, Grayson," he called out, voice dripping with amusement. "No need to be rude." Thomas's grip tightened around the gun. He knew how this worked. They weren't here to talk. They were here to push him, to force his hand. Beside him, Claire whispered, "What's the plan?" Thomas's mind raced. Running wasn't an option. They'd find them again. Hiding? That wasn't in his nature. That left only one choice. He took a slow breath, then met Claire's gaze. "In this." Her fingers brushed his arm, a silent agreement. Another knock. Louder this time. The past had come knocking. And Thomas was ready to answer. The night air was thick with tension, pressing down like a suffocating weight. Thomas and Claire stood side by side, their backs against the cold wooden walls of the cabin. Outside, the 3 figures waited, their patience eerie, their presence a silent promise of violence. Another knock, this time more forceful, almost taunting. Thomas exhaled, steadying his grip on the gun. He had been in situations like this before, but this time, something felt different. It wasn't just his life at stake, it was Claire's too. "They won't leave," she murmured, voice barely audible. "I know," he replied. A beat of silence. Then the scarred man outside spoke again. "We can do this the hard way, Grayson. Or the really hard way." Thomas exchanged a glance with Claire. There was no negotiating with people like them. He knew that better than anyone. Then, a sudden crash, glass shattering in the back of the house. "They're splitting up," Claire hissed, her body tensing. Thomas cursed under his breath. They had to act fast. He signaled to Claire, pointing toward the back. She nodded and moved swiftly, her footsteps soundless. Another window broke, followed by the creak of someone stepping onto the porch. They were closing in. Thomas positioned himself near the front door, gun raised. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. The door handle twisted. He took a breath, muscles coiled, ready. Then, everything happened at once. The door burst open and Thomas fired. The first man staggered back, a guttural sound escaping his lips before he collapsed. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw movement, a second attacker lunging at him from the shadows. He twisted, raising his arm just in time to block a knife aimed for his throat. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but he didn't let go of his gun. Claire's shot rang out, and the second man fell. But before Thomas could catch his breath, the scarred man stepped into the doorway, a twisted smile on his face. Well, he drawled. "Still got some fight in you?" Thomas tightened his grip, leveling the gun at the man's chest. "Last chance. Walk away." The scarred man chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about money. It's not even about revenge." He took a slow step forward. "This is about finishing what you started." Thomas's blood ran cold. He knew those words too well. Then, before the scarred man could move, a single shot rang out. His eyes widened in shock before his body crumpled to the floor. Claire stood behind him, gun still raised, her expression unreadable. For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Then, Claire exhaled shakily. "It's over." Thomas looked down at the lifeless bodies, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He knew better than to believe in easy endings. But as he met Claire's gaze, he realized one thing. They had survived. The silence that followed was deafening. The cabin, once filled with the echoes of gunfire and desperate breaths, now stood eerily still. The scent of blood and gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the dampness of the night. Claire lowered her gun slowly, her hands trembling despite the rush of adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Thomas, clutching his wounded shoulder, leaned against the wall, his breath ragged. "It's over," Claire whispered again, as if saying it twice would make it true. But Thomas knew better. The bodies on the floor were proof of their survival, but also of something much darker. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. One he had spent years trying to outrun. "We need to leave," he said, pushing himself off the wall despite the pain shooting through his arm. His voice was firm, but his mind raced with the implications. If the scarred man had found him here, it meant others could too. Claire met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Who are they?" she asked, though deep down she already knew the answer. Thomas hesitated before exhaling heavily. "People I thought I had left behind." A gust of wind howled through the shattered window, making the curtains flutter like ghostly figures. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a graveyard. Footsteps crunched outside, distant, but unmistakable. Claire's grip on her gun tightened. "Thomas?" He didn't need to be told. The past wasn't done with him yet. The sunrise slowly painted the sky with a soft orange hue. Claire and Thomas stood on the hill, gazing into the distance, where the forest lay silent, as if it had never witnessed the horrors of the past nights. They had fought, they had lost, but most importantly, they had survived. Thomas tightened his grip on Claire's hand, feeling the warmth of something real after days of fear. "We won't be afraid anymore," he said firmly. Claire nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. The past might haunt them, but they had chosen to move forward, to a future of freedom. Thank you for watching the whole video. If you don't like this content, please comment 0. If you find the video useful, please comment 1. Subscribe to the channel and remember to turn on the notification bell to watch other interesting content. See you in the next video.